Hello, everyone. My name is Jenny Zhang, and I am the Associate Manager of Data Insights at CECP. I am so thrilled that so many of you are joining our special webinar to celebrate our newest release, Giving in Numbers 2017 edition. We have a full hour that will be interactive. We've got many key highlights to share, and of course, I am so thrilled to be interviewing my colleague and the lead author of this report, Andre Solorzano.
Hello, Jeannie, and hello to the public. It's a true honor to be part of this webinar to show some of the first findings of Giving Numbers that was just released on Tuesday.
Right, just Tuesday. So just a mere 48 hours, and we're still basking in the celebration and the joy of being able to share these data insights that I know you led for several months. And for those who are joining and still signing in, we've got one handout on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar chat box. This also will be the first of 2 webinars, and you'll see that we have several polls for those attendees to tell us which topic or topics you'd like for us to focus on for the second webinar. So please stay tuned for that. And of course, our report is done with many companies contributing, which of course we will also hear about, but with also our friends from the conference board. So we of course thank them for their collaboration. Now, Andre, we know that the survey happens at the beginning of the year. You spend many months analyzing the data as a chief analyst in-house. Tell us what was the most exciting part about writing the report?
Yes, it's a very comprehensive process that goes from the survey outreach, which you lead. There's a really thorough process in terms of collecting the data and then analyzing the data. One of the things that calls my attention is the richness of the report, how many variables related to corporate societal engagement we have, and also it's really interesting to see year by year how the trends can actually change from what we saw in the previous year.
And I know that we've got this full hour to ask you questions and put you in the hot seat to ensure that we walk away fully informed. And for those joining the webinar, do keep in mind that with your GoToWebinar text box on the right-hand side, you can actually send us your questions during the webinar. We will be able to review your questions, we will answer them, and then if for some reason we run out of time, we can certainly follow up with you. So please feel free to utilize that question little box on the right-hand side. And for those who may not be familiar with CECP, we've got a picture here with Paul Newman, one of our co-founders and co-chair of CECP, and this quote that you see helps start the underlying value of what CECP stands for, and the idea that corporations can be a force for good in society, moving beyond just the business, but also integrating, being a little more savvy. And 20 years later now, close to 20 years later now, we're able to see the work that so many companies are doing in thinking beyond just charitable giving or total giving, but engaging employees, which of course we will also hear about. And then as part of a proud team member of the Data Insights team, Andre and I, we help not only just affiliated companies, but the corporate sector as a whole in walking them through this process of collecting data, helping them compare. Of course, we need to evaluate as well, and then share the data insights. So equipping all of those in using the data, one of which, of course, is our Giving in Numbers. And so with that, let's start off with our first poll of the webinar. We like to ask, how familiar are you with Giving in Numbers research? So on your screen, 1 would be not very familiar, and 5 would be very familiar. So let's wait a little bit as we see the responses come in. Andre, any predictions as to who's joining us on our webinar today?
Yes, my guess is that our public will be very familiar, leaning towards the 5.
Okay, although it wouldn't be so bad if it was the other way with 1, because that means we've got some new reading club members of your report.
Absolutely. It's always good to have new public into it that is eager to learn more about the report.
Right, right. And then as we wait for additional polls to come in, please remember to type in your questions in your question box. So with that, let's close the survey and share the results. It looks like we have 35% saying very familiar with the report. So you're in good company, Andre.
Excellent.
And we've got, let's see, only 3% saying they're not familiar. So for those 3%, we certainly welcome you, and we're so thrilled that you're joining us.
Yeah, there's also more potential to convey more about the findings of the report.
Okay, wonderful. So with that, let's go back to our presentation and make sure that we can see our agenda. All right, so we've got a packed agenda on some of the different topics, and this actually mirrors the way that you've written out the report.
Exactly, it follows the same structure as well.
So we'll begin with the respondents profile. We'll talk about some of the total giving trends that we're seeing, some program areas. We know we have a special highlight and trend that we'll get to, employee engagement through volunteerism and matching gifts, a focus on international giving, and of course measurement and some of the grants and recipient trends.
Yes.
So Andre, tell us about this year's respondent profile and what and who they are.
Yes, it's really important to know the context in which the report took place, and we are really pleased to announce that this year we had a total of 258 companies of the world's largest companies. The requirement, as you may know, to participate in the survey is that each company has to have at least $2 billion in annual revenue. So we have 258 large companies that participated in this year's report. Also, it's important to know the potential of the contributions that all these companies have in an overall way. In aggregate terms, their contributions added up to almost $21 billion. To put things in context, this is equivalent to the gross domestic product of a middle-income country. So basically, we have the GDP of our entire nation with all the aggregate contributions from all these companies.
That's incredible to think about the scale of data that is packed into this report that comes out every year.
Exactly, and the impact that companies have in society. And this report and the collection of the data happened throughout the spring of 2017. About 2016 contributions, that is important to mention, that reflects data from fiscal year 16 about purpose societal engagement trends.
Wonderful. And for those, we should also know the Giving in Numbers report is available on CECP's website, cecp.co. And you'll see as we go through the presentation, we'll identify which pages you can turn to right now to follow along. So for the respondent profile and some information, you could refer to page 37 to 39. And again, just so glad that we are working on the report in association with our friends at the Conference Board. Andre, tell us a little bit more about the history of the research, because we know that not 100% of our attendees are familiar with Giving in Numbers.
Absolutely. There is a long legacy in terms of collecting data for Giving in Numbers. The collection of corporate societal engagement trends from the Giving in Numbers report started back in 2001. We've been collecting data on contributions, employee engagement, and many other trends since 2001. And since 2012, we started producing this report in collaboration with our friends from the Conference Board.
And Andre, as our chief analyst and as the lead author, you apply a certain set of rigor to the report, and we'll be hearing this throughout this presentation, but tell us a little bit more about this 3-year match set, because we'll be hearing you say that a lot, as well as readers will be reading that quite a bit.
Yes, one of the major milestones of this report is that it has a really significant sample. One of the important aspects of the report is that we are able to show long-term trends. The most common one we use is what we call a 3-year match set, which basically refers to analyzing the data of companies that have provided data on different metrics for each of the last 3 years.
Okay, so really being able to do that year-over-year match. And also you do quite a bit of work in ensuring that the data is inflation adjusted as well.
Exactly, and also this intends to compare apples with apples, to make everything comparable, to make sure we have the same companies when we analyze long-term trends.
Wonderful. And so let's actually get into some dollars and data and numbers. So the top quartile is something that you talk about. We've been mentioning it in our research for several years. Tell us what that top quartile means and what it represents in this year's research.
Yes, this is an important statistic measure. We want our companies to benchmark themselves against the best. A top quartile means what is the cutoff data point which places you in the top 25 of all companies. So for instance, if a company wants to belong to the top 25% of companies in terms of total giving, this company has to have given at least $52 million in total giving. That's the cutoff point. And also, using the same analogy for cash giving, a company should have given at least $36 million in total cash giving to be part of that top 25% of companies. That places them above the other 75% of companies. But we know that revenues and absolute number of total giving also varies, but we also have a relative measurement that allows us to compare companies, which is the ratio of total giving as a percentage of revenues. In this sense, we know that if a company wants to be part of the top 25% of companies in terms of this ratio, they have to have at least allocated 0.22% of their revenues into total giving. In other words, suppose that, for instance, a company has $10 billion in revenues. This ratio would imply that that company gave at least $22 million in total giving.
That's wonderful.
And we also have the same metric for total giving as a percentage of pre-tax profits.
And, you know, Andre, that's just so great to think about that percentage, because we know that not every company will find the dollar value, the 52 million, the 36 million in cash giving. Some companies do not have non-cash giving, so perhaps the percentage might be a more relevant data point.
Exactly.
As opposed to perhaps an absolute value.
Absolutely.
And then you do have benchmarking tables on page 35 to 36 that breaks down by industry level.
Exactly, and also by revenue tiers, by industry. We also have other ratios of total cash giving as a percentage of, actually matching gives as a percentage of total cash giving, and other metrics that are really important for our companies to do their own benchmarking.
And then depending on the company, this may sound very high or very low, but in a source of inspiration, we know that this is essentially a benchmark. So you say that it's the top 25%, but there are quite a number of companies who are giving at higher levels than these numbers that we're seeing.
Exactly. This is the cutoff point to be part of that top 25% of companies.
So now this is a snapshot of just this year, so 2016 data. The next topic is interesting because this is where you actually apply that CECP rigor and that analysis perspective of a year-over-year change, specifically over 3 years. So we see that the headline here, and we mention it in the report and also in the press release that is available as a handout in your GoToWebinar text box. The total giving overall increased by 2.3%. So that's incredible when you think about that 0.22% of revenue as being a good benchmark for a top quartile. I mean, we're talking about 2.3% increases, but there was a standout, and it pertains to the healthcare industry. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Exactly. We wouldn't want our public to leave this webinar without knowing how much the median of total giving increased between 2014 and 16, which, as you mentioned, increased by 2.3%. So that's a really significant and really important metric to know. But also, we want to know at the aggregate level. That means when we add up all the increases from our companies, among all those increases between 2014 and 16, we wanted to know which industry was collaborating or was allocating more of that increase. And we saw that half of that aggregate increase across all industries came from the healthcare industry. And particularly when we did a deep dive into those healthcare companies, we saw that it was basically pharmaceuticals who had given that increase among all the other healthcare companies, and all companies actually.
And then so we're talking about the increases. So interesting to note again the healthcare industry role, and then when you look and drill down a bit further, it was the pharmaceuticals that had a big role in contributing to these increases.
Yes, and when we did a deep dive into the reasons why these pharmaceuticals increased their total giving, we saw that there was a significant increase in product donations given by the increased demand in patient assistance programs that are happening right now.
And such a relevant topic today, of course. And then what about some trends that you've seen also in the decreases that pertain to the healthcare industry?
Interestingly, also, when we aggregated the total decrease in total giving, we saw that it was also the healthcare industry that was allocating a bigger proportion of this decrease. But the difference is that we have different sub-industries between these healthcare companies that promoted this reduction. It was coming mainly from facilities and medical equipment healthcare companies. So these are different companies from the other ones we saw as the increasers.
So again, just a healthcare snapshot over that 3-year period. Andre, you do write about this on page 8 of the report. I see that we've got a quick question about whether this data is tied to the $20 billion that you mentioned earlier that represents the 2017 respondent profile.
Yes, that is correct. This is the total, if we want to call it in a different way, the total size of the pie is $21 billion. So this is comparing just all those dollars that actually increased. That's what we have on the left-hand side of the slide. And when we saw all those dollars that decreased and we actually add them up, that's what we have on the right-hand side of the slide. And yes, the total size of the pie is $21 billion.
So that's really helpful, and that's a wonderful question. Thank you for that. So more on page 8. And you know, when we talk about some of the changes, that's helpful. But we also saw that there were some interesting changes when we looked at the information on where and what focus the funds were going to. So with that, there was a new finding in our report that we hadn't seen in recent years. It was one of the headlines in our press release, and it was pertaining to culture and arts. Tell us a little bit more about this.
This is very interesting, and at a personal level, it really encourages me and makes me happy to see that companies are giving a special emphasis on culture and the arts. When we compared 2014 and 16 and made an assessment on how the median cash giving has changed among all these cost areas, we saw that culture and the arts is the program area that increased the most in terms of its median cash giving. It increased by 48%.
Okay, and so again, this is the breaker that we mentioned, the 3-year match sets. The same group of companies back in 2014, you look at where they were allocating their total giving to, and then we fast forward to 2016, and it's that 48% increase.
Exactly. In other words, if a company was giving in 2014 $100 in terms of cash giving for culture and the arts, this implies that in 2016, that same company was giving $150 in cash giving.
And then can you share with everyone what is included in this category of culture and arts?
Oh, absolutely. This category includes contributions to aspects like museums, arts funds, theaters, cultural centers, television, radio, dance groups, music groups, heritage foundations, and non-academic libraries.
And then we know that there's a question here asking about the increases and whether it's coming from a certain type or a certain I guess, subgroup within segment of the company. Well, according to our valuation guidance, so we specify what is included in culture and arts, but we also say to report to CECP's survey on which category best describes the ultimate end recipient. So even though, so the intent of the gift is important, and the category that companies are filling out should reflect the purpose of the grant, not the type of nonprofit.
Yes, and this increase, I mean, we're referring to cash giving, but overall, when we saw the increase in total giving for culture and arts, we saw that non-cash giving for culture and the arts the increase is minimal. It's mainly coming from cash giving. That means foundation and direct cash.
And not non-cash, like
exactly.
Product donations that companies can report.
Exactly. And actually, the median amount of non-cash giving for culture and the arts actually decreased but this is compensated by this increase in cash giving for culture and the arts.
And then here we've got the full list of some of the different changes that we saw. Again, this is the match set, the same group of companies over a 3-year time period. And we see environment has decreased, but please do not despair for the environmentalists out there. We know that there are industry differences and that there are certain industries that are staying steadfast with their focus on the environment.
Exactly, and different sociopolitical or exogenous factors can always influence what companies decide to invest in.
Yeah, and we know that that's great. And then, of course, there's more information on page 12 of the report. So with that, let's just jump into our second poll of the conference, of the webinar. We'd like to hear from you on what factors do you think help explain this change in the giving to culture and arts? Could it be something within the company that was done via a strategic decision change? Was it perhaps driven by employees who were speaking up and talking about their own priorities? Was it maybe a factor outside of the company, other or unsure? And if you are selecting other, we'd love to hear via either the question or the chat box and letting us know what you think the other might be. Andre, any predictions as to what you think the folks might be saying to this poll?
My guess is it would go to number 3, but let's see what. I don't want to bias anyone.
Okay, so I see that responses are coming, and let's close this, and I will share the results. So this is interesting. So we have 35% saying that they believe it was actually driven by the employees. So, and we know that that is a trend that we're seeing across all CECP research. We know that we've been hearing directly from the CEOs themselves saying that employees are such an important stakeholder and that their opinions matter. So that's
definitely, this is really interesting.
31% say that they believe it was external factor or factors outside of the company. 27% saying that it was a strategic decision change by the company.
And this shows how the sense of purpose from employees is being taken into account by companies. And we have a question here. Was there any certain industry that was investing more heavily in culture and the arts? And the answer is that indeed the communications industry was the one that was allocating more of their total giving into culture and the arts. They were allocating 13% of their total giving into this cost area. But in terms of the median cash giving into culture and the arts, it was the consumer staples that had the highest median cash giving into this cost area, with $1.27 million per company.
And this is great. We're actually getting quite a bit of comments and feedback from the audience. Some comments on they think that it might be executives speaking up, so they can be counted as employees. International giving, greater international appreciation, and emphasis of arts. And we know that companies, right, that they do offer employee discounts or free admission to cultural museums and institutions. So that is certainly true. And I know that, Andre, this resonates with you too, because you are actually an artist when you're not running numbers and writing the Giving in Numbers report.
Yes, I'm personally passionate about culture and the arts. That's I would call it my sanity refreshment through painting. But it's also important to mention that there have been some other external studies that have been showing the implications of promoting culture and the arts. For instance, our friends from Reinvest Fund and the University of Pennsylvania released the Culture and Social Well-Being in New York City, which showed how culture and the arts help promote social well-being in terms of safety, health across the most disadvantaged, economically speaking, neighborhoods in New York City. Also, our friends from Americans for the Arts released their Arts and Economic Prosperity 5 report, which shows how culture and the arts actually creates a big portion of the economy. It basically generates $166 billion in economic advantages.
166 billion, so that's with a B.
Exactly.
And then so you do write about this on page 12 of the report if anyone wanted to follow along. So with that, and with the refrain of employees being a big part, it's appropriate that we will now be talking about employee volunteerism.
Exactly.
And we know that there has been some positive data with this as well. So tell us a little bit more.
Yes, we see the trend that employee engagement has been increasing. We saw that the average volunteer participation rate, that means the percentage of employees that have volunteered at least 1 hour on company time, has been increasing over the course of the last 3 years. And again, this 3-year match set, we saw that this percentage of employees volunteering increased from 31% in 2014 to 34% in 2016. So basically, 3 out of 10 employees have been volunteering among our companies.
And this is great because of the size of companies in this data set, we're talking about tens of thousands of employees, and to say 1 out of 3 are being engaged and volunteering out in the community is such a positive trend. Now tell us what type of volunteerism is included in here.
Yes, this includes domestic and international volunteer programs. In other words, programs that are offered to domestic end recipients and also international end recipients. And then because volunteerism is such a big topic for companies these days, what are other types of data that you have analyzed in this year's report? Yes, volunteering has so many implications in terms of the total number of volunteer hours. If you add up all those volunteer hours, that has a really important economic value in terms of the opportunity cost of using employees' time into helping into different cost areas. We have aspects of volunteer hours by on-company time, off-company time. We also have metrics in terms of percentage of companies that are measuring the business value of their employee engagement programs.
And this is great. We do have a topic later about measurement, but we know that companies are increasing the tracking of all sorts of employee engagement. And a data point that we don't have here, but you do talk about in the report, is the tracking of employee hours. And we know overall employee sense of purpose and employee engagement opportunities offered by companies are such a vital way to drive their participation, whether it's during work hours or outside of the office.
Exactly.
So more on pages 16 through 17 that you write about?
That is correct. So we have really different, many other volunteering aspects that are really important.
Now, I did mention at the beginning of this webinar that this would be the first of 2 webinars, and our second one will be, it will be crowdsourced. So it will depend on which topics that individuals would like for us to focus on. So we've got 4 more topics, but we wanted to take a pause here and see if there were 1 or 2, and if you'd like all 4, that can certainly work too, but let us know if there is one particular topic that you would like for us to focus on. All right, so we've got responses coming in. I just want to make sure that everyone is able to respond. And it looks like we're getting a close tie, so we might end up having to share all 4 topics, but we'll see.
And we're eager to share more of our findings, so this is it's really a close.
Okay, so let's share what the attendees so far have said. So, wow, it is we've got a third of those attending right now saying program areas is a topic they'd like to learn more about, as well as volunteerism. Perfect. And then a tie with the other 2 topics on top quartile and total given changes.
But I would say it's pretty well distributed.
Well, yes. So stay tuned for our second poll later on after you hear about the next 4 topics. But that's great that we've got some good engagement and interest from all of our attendees. And with that, let's get back to our webinar and our PowerPoint slide. And so we just talked about employee engagement, volunteerism, matching gifts. We know that this is such a popular way for companies to engage with their employees. And this data point of the majority of companies offering matching gift programs, not a new trend, right? We of course would want to see, and we have been seeing a consistent level of companies investing into matching gift programs. But you do actually talk about one new finding, so please share a little bit more about that.
Yes, we see that offering matching gift programs is the rule and not the exception. And we saw that the trends have remained stable, but it's important to mention that there has been an increase in the offering of disaster relief matching gift programs. And also, it was interesting for us to realize that median dollar amount for disaster relief has also increased by 91%, which is way higher than for any other matching gift program.
So 91%, so it's almost pretty much doubling
yes,
between 2015 to 2016.
Exactly.
Now, given that this is FY16 data, and in the calendar year 2017, we've already experienced so many natural disasters at home and in the U.S., I think it will be very interesting to look at the data next year, and we anticipate that there will be robust metrics coming in.
Yes, we are eager to see how these trends change for the data we collect next year, but we can anticipate that some of the trends for disaster relief are going to change next year, and we're almost, I think we're around the corner in terms of launching our survey. So
that's right. And we will of course make sure that everyone is looped in with all of the details. But you do focus and dedicate pages 20 through 21 on this topic, and you even provide the specifics for each of these matching gift programs. So they include things like caps and ratios,
open or limited matching gifts program. So we have a lot of data in there.
And just so very interesting. So please do refer to our Giving in Numbers report. And I know that you also mentioned and you gather data on percentage of programs that are being offered or participation from international employees. And that's actually a nice tie-in to our next topic of international giving. So with our companies who are just becoming much more globalized, you know, globalization is such a big thing. It is no surprise that companies typically are allocating 20% of their entire giving to international end recipients. Tell us what kind of new findings that you saw with this year's report.
So it's really interesting to see that 2 out of $10 that companies invest in society go to international end recipients. This is consistent from what we've been seeing in the past. Also, we can see that this percentage varies across industries. Companies in the energy industry, which tend to have a more international footprint, are allocating a higher percentage of international giving from total giving, 26%, as opposed to an industry that tends to have a more local footprint, like the utilities industry, which with 3%. And I would add, this is an interesting topic. Basically, we also know that 2 out of 3 companies provide international contributions.
And that's great. And, you know, that makes sense certainly with the utility sector, where because their grid might be limited to an actual and geographic region that, you know, of course, their international giving wouldn't be as high as perhaps some of the other industry. So, Andre, I know that today we're celebrating the Giving in Numbers launch, and it is very exciting, but the truth is that we're actually celebrating a different release today as well. And this is another report that you lead with both the analysis and the writing, which is called Giving Around the Globe, and will be released today on CECP.co. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, we have another major milestone to celebrate at CECP because we are about to release our other report, our other really important annual report, which is Giving Around the Globe 2017 edition, with different trends of purpose societal engagement for different regions in the world, from Latin America, Asia, Europe, and Africa. We have different aspects such as how SDGs are shaping businesses all over the world, and how technology is disrupting purpose and employee engagement in all these regions.
And we know that the big differentiator with these two reports, Giving in Numbers, is highly focused on industry and sector breakdown and differences. But Giving Around the Globe, the differentiator for that one is that you really focus on a regional level. And so you're able to say, you know, there are some cultural and some regional differences with the way that companies in the corporate sector are engaging with their employees. Any interesting findings there that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Absolutely. It called my attention that companies in Europe actually provide a higher percentage of companies in Europe gave internationally than even in North America. And also companies in Asia, actually Asia is the region with the highest offering of pro bono services, with 61% of Asian companies offering this type of volunteer program.
And, you know, speaking of pro bono volunteerism, we actually are all celebrating Pro Bono Week this week, and so it'll actually end, but it's celebrated towards the latter half of October every year, and led by our friends, the Taproot Foundation. And of course, CECP helped, CECP and the Taproot Foundation work together to develop a valuation guidance on how companies can assign a dollar value to their employees' work. So more information of that on CECP's website, Pro Bono Week. And then speaking of volunteerism, we have a question about whether companies are including volunteer hours in the total giving data. So we talked a lot earlier on in this presentation, but CECP, we ask companies to report the number of hours so that it does happen. But only certain types of volunteerism can be counted as a type of giving, and that is just pro bono service. So it actually is a nice tie-in with this topic that we're on. And again, more information on that valuation guidance online for pro bono service. So with that, let's jump into our category on measurement. We traditionally speak about measurement, and you write about it in the latter chapters of the report, but it's probably one of our most important trends because it allows us to talk about the data since companies are measuring it.
Absolutely.
And one of the headlines this year is that 81%, so 8 out of 10 companies are measuring societal outcomes and or impacts. And here you provided us some data to break down that 81%. So please tell us a little bit more.
Yes, of course. Companies are also interested in knowing what's the actual impact of their societal programs, how their money is being, or actually non-cash giving as well, can be spent in society. So we also want to know what type of measurement they are doing. And we know that companies have to be strategic in terms of how they allocate their internal resources. So we saw that 38% of companies that are measuring the societal outcomes and or impacts of their grants are doing so in just their flagship or strategic program, as opposed to those companies that are measuring on all their grants, which just represents 18%. We also saw that 12% of companies are measuring the societal outcomes or impacts in just grants above a certain threshold of investment, and a mixture between being above certain threshold or a cost area represented 6% of companies, and companies that are measuring their outcomes on just a specific type of program area represents 13%.
Okay, so again, that headline being that of the 81% who are measuring their outcomes and or impacts, 38% of them are just allocating and focusing just on the strategic program. And then just to clarify with this threshold, this is companies saying we will apply this level of measurement and evaluation for grants over a certain size.
Exactly.
And it's I see that in your pie chart you kind of go around and say threshold, and then there's some companies who say it's only the filter of a certain cause area that meet a certain
mixed
threshold.
with a threshold, yes.
So more information on pages 25 through 27 of the report. And we're coming to our last topic of our webinar, which was a big key takeaway that we mentioned both in our press release and in the report as well. And it's focused on the idea that there are deeper partnerships. So Andre, tell us a little bit more about this. I see that you've got two sets of data points here, the orange representing grant size, the gray representing grants per FTE.
Absolutely. So we knew from our analysis that 67% of respondents decreased their recipients. But as we can see from the chart, from the gray line, there was a decrease in the median number of grants made by each member of a contributions team, which went from 65 to 57 in 2016. And this came along, as you can see from the orange line, with an increase in the median grant size, which went from $33,000 per company to $40,000 in 2016. So this has different components. We know that the number of grants increased, the grant size also increased, but the recipients decreased.
So just to repeat that, the median grant size is going up. And again, this is a 3-year match set, so of course we know that you love to apply that. So looking at the same group of companies over a 3-year time period, the median grant size had gone up, whereas the grants per FTE had gone down. And this is due to the FTE size going down, or is it the number of grants going down?
It's a combination. The number of grants is actually going up, and the value of each grant is also going up. But companies are having deeper partnerships, so they're being more selective in terms of which recipients they are selecting and the resources they apply to this. So as you can see, the number of grants per FTE has decreased, but in other words, the amount of the checks companies write to their grantees has been increasing.
You know, in a way, this trend resonates with me on a personal level because I think of it as a analogy to the grocery store trips that I might make in a given month. So I may decrease the number of times I go to the grocery store, but that in turn increases each bill that I have to pay when I'm checking out. Of course, that might be tied to personal diet and lifestyle choice. And I think the good thing is that in this instance with the corporations and with this data that it shows companies are seeking deeper impact of their grants. And then before we head to our next poll, we have a quick question asking us to clarify what we have meant with measuring societal outcomes with the prior data point. Andre, do you mind just sharing a little bit more about that?
Yes, the Giving Numbers survey asked respondents to use a logic model that goes from assessing inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. So each respondent had to select which level they were in this logic model continuum. And this applies to the measurement of the societal outcomes or impacts of their grants or their societal investments.
And readers can actually see a little bit more about that on pages 25 through 27. We also do make available the survey questions on CECP's website if anyone wanted to see how the question was phrased originally. And then I know in past years, we've provided some case studies as well on how companies, what were some unique approaches with measurement. This year, although we don't have case studies in that section, we do have it for employee engagement and some of the other sections. So
absolutely, and for volunteerism and focus areas.
Wonderful. So with that, let's get to our next poll on asking those who are joining us, of the last 4 topics that you just heard, which topic would you like for us to focus on further for our second webinar? And while we wait for that to happen, I should also note that second webinar is already scheduled for Tuesday, November 14th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. So after we wrap up the webinar, we will be sending out the link and some additional information. So it looks like the responses are still coming in. Andre, any final predictions for which of these 4 topics might be most interesting?
My guess is number 4.
Number 4 being grants and recipients, so the one that you just saw. And I wonder if everyone is thinking about their grocery trips now and analyzing their bills.
And exactly, and they're buying priorities.
And you know, oh, and I see responses still coming in. We've got such a high number of attendees, so numbers are still jumping. The report, because it is so in-depth, we were only able to cover 8 topics, and you do talk a bit more about some of the other topics that are happening at the corporate sector as a whole. For those attending, and anyone who might have been disappointed that we weren't able to talk about some of the other topics, feel free to send us a question and let us know if you'd like a different focus area or a different question to be addressed in our second webinar. So feel free to send us a note in our question box on the GoToWebinar box on your right-hand side.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the aspects that I'm most happy about the report. It's the richness of topics we can cover. So feel free to let us know which topics you would like us to cover.
Okay, so let's share the response with this particular poll. So here we have a clear winner.
Absolutely, and I was wrong.
Okay, well, it was, so measurement of outcomes was very interesting to our attendees. They'd like to learn more, so an appetite there. And matching gifts.
Followed by grants and recipients.
And international giving. Okay, maybe they know that they can get all the answers by reading your second report, Giving Around the Globe, for international giving.
Exactly. There are different trends, and not in terms of not only employee engagement, but also in terms of median giving across different regions and many other metrics.
Wonderful. So with that, we do have some time to dedicate just to open questions. Feel free to please type them in. We have a question asking about disaster relief. We've got a couple of questions, so we probably won't be able to get to all of it, but Andre, maybe you can just start us off with sharing a little bit more. I mean, we talked about disaster relief in the context of matching gifts, but you've got some great insights on a year-over-year basis as well.
Yes, so we've seen that across all industries, almost all industries have decreased in the course of the last 3 years, the percentage of total giving that they allocate into disaster relief. That's a trend we've been seeing. And also, we know the question actually asks, if we can cut the data to look at the same level of disaster and response to determine if there were more disasters or higher response relative to some disaster. And what we can actually do, and we've done it in the past and presented it in blogs, is that we use the data from the International Disaster Database from the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, and we have crossed that data with our own data related to corporate societal engagement for disaster relief. So we've seen, and from what I can remember, the number of disasters has been increasing from 2014 to 16. And what we have so far in 2017 looks like we're going to end up the year with more money in terms of damages and total affected number of people.
Okay, well then this is a rally call back to the environmentalists who are joining us, saying, you know, perhaps a call and a focus for resiliency and sustainability. And then for those who wanted to hear that again, this is the International Disaster Database, the website being emdat.be.
Exactly.
emdat.be.
So we can do that type of cross-tabulation and analysis in which we can compare the level of disasters with our total giving figures related to disaster relief.
And again, you did write a blog post on this a year ago. So for folks who'd like to look that up, just visit CECP.co, go to our blog. You can click on their insights and just type in disaster relief, and I'm sure it will be one of the top search results. We've got a question about giving around the globe. And they just said, would there be a focus on SDGs? SDGs, of course, being the Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely. We have a section which we analyze how companies all over the world are using the SDGs, how the SDGs are shaping business in times of political uncertainty and uncountable globalization. So we can see how our companies are building partnerships to use the SDGs, even in different levels. So there's more information in our newly released report given around the globe.
And what page is that for folks to have reference on? It looks like page 3.
Page 3 of the report.
Okay, yeah. That's great. So to close, wanted to ensure that everyone is aware that companies are invited to participate in our next year's survey. It will launch in January, and although 2018 sounds like it's far away, we know that the activities that all of you are doing now in your respective workplaces will be so vital to the survey and the research that we hopefully will be reporting out on in 1 year's time from today. So more information to come. You can certainly look out for emails from CECP and most likely from me, Jenny Jung. And then also save the date, the next webinar, Tuesday, November 14th at 12 p.m. Again, that's Eastern Time. We will be sharing the topics. We'll go back, tabulate the responses, and see how we can carve out that 1 hour that would be most beneficial for those attending, including some friends that we know were not able to join today. And then please feel free to visit ccp.co to download the 2 reports, Giving in Numbers as well as Giving Around the Globe. We think both of them are filled with such useful, exciting data. And then for those who are affiliated with CECP, you have the access to customized benchmarking. There is a self-access tool, and of course you can reach out for more information on getting deeper insights on anything we've shared within this webinar, as well as what might be in the report or that CECP collects. And of course, we'd like to thank our sponsors for this year's report: Citigroup, Newman Stone Foundation, PwC, Travelers, USAA, and of course our friends at the conference board. And with that, Andre, do you have any closing thoughts for the folks who are joining us today?
I want to really thank all our companies who participated in this year's report. You guys make this report and all the information available and possible. Without you, this wouldn't be happening. And I also want to praise all the thorough work that Jeannie does in terms of doing survey outreach and collecting this really important data.
Thank you, Andre, for your kind words, and I'd like to give that note of gratitude back to our companies and even those who do not participate in the survey. The readers are such a vital component of this community.
Absolutely.
Who help this research continue strong. So with that, note of deep gratitude for all of those joining us today, and for those who will continue reading our report. And you know how to reach CECP. Let us know if you have any feedback, insights, comments. We truly welcome them. So with that, thank you so much and hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much.